My name is Stanislaw Robert Liberto with AV Ultra, and in this lesson, we're going to be making some titles that actually push the screen when we put them in Final Cut Pro 10. These are based on LenoFX's Sidebar titles that he has on his website for sale. And I wanted to reach out to him and make sure that, hey, is this okay that I'm doing a lesson on this? And he actually wrote back to me and said, hey, that's no problem. I think this is totally cool. So let's go ahead and get started. If we open up our AV Ultra Lesson 28A end, we can take a look and see how this is put together. In our 28A end, we have two main groups. We have our title background, which is what you see in the background here. And then we also have our main group. And our main group is our title. For our background, we have a Dropzone that is set up for right now. And we have a series of published parameters that we can access inside Final Cut. To better illustrate these published parameters, let's open up Final Cut and take a look and see how these react once we place them in our timeline. Back inside Final Cut, I'm reviewing one of the lessons that I have put together all about motion tracking. And what I'm going to do is just grab one of those push titles and place it on top of my video in my timeline. When playing back my timeline, you can see that it will move my screen up just a little bit to accommodate the room for this title. Based on the published parameters that I've set before, I can access the color of my different backgrounds and customize this to better suit my needs. Now that we understand how it works, let's go ahead and get started with Lesson A. What I've done is I've already created a composition of our different titles and our title backgrounds. Once our animation is all complete, then I'm going to change this into a title template layer. The reason why we're going to change this into a title template layer is, if you remember from my lesson, anything that we put onto this placeholder is actually going to affect the video behind it in Final Cut. To get started, I'm just going to turn off this title background so it's not distracting us, and we can work on just this title composition. My total duration of my project currently is about 5 seconds, and you can see some items popping on and popping off. And that's not really that important. What is important is that I have these markers. So you can see I have a build-in marker, and at the end I have a build-out marker. Anytime we use this build-in marker, we're going to want to make sure all our animation that happens is complete before this marker point. For animate out, we want to make sure that all our animation happens after our build-out marker point. I've provided a main group title that you can work with right away if you choose. Otherwise, we're going to recreate this from scratch. First thing I recommend doing is always creating a new group in which to work with. We're going to rename this group Title Bar. In our Title Bar group, the first thing I'm going to create in there is a rectangle, and this rectangle will serve the purpose of being our back plate. Once I've created that, I'll open the inspector so I can change the color. I'm going to change this to a gradient, and by default, it will always pull up this kind of gradient. And that's not necessarily what I'm looking for, so I'm going to click my color swatches and choose the colors that I want to work with. In my example, I'm choosing a light and a bit of a dark. I'm looking to fine-tune this color placement a little bit, so I'm going to open up the Adjust Item tool and drag out my handles to give a little bit of a softer edge. These points that I'm grabbing represent the different color swatches, and as I'm moving them, you can see how the color is adjusting proportionately. By moving this tab, I can adjust the influence of a specific color. As these are settings that I'm going to want to access in Final Cut, I want to make sure that I publish these specific colors. So I'm choosing the swatches and hitting Publish. Now that I'm happy with the color, what I want to do is organize this, and so I'm going to rename my group to Main Bar. We're going to take that layer and duplicate it by hitting Command D, and I'm going to rename this to Title Card. Now that I have my title card, I'm going to want to adjust this a little bit because it's the same size as our other one. Let's go into our inspector, and we're going to change the geometry of this to about 1200. Let's move this all the way to the left-hand side where our title card will be. I'm going to move it just a little further over to the edge, and the next thing we're going to do is change the anchor point. Using our anchor point control, I'm going to move this all the way to the left. One special note about anchor points is currently there's no way to snap an anchor point to the edge of a shape or object. In all my time of using this, I've never been able to figure this out, so if anyone has any tips on how to lock this to a corner or edge, other than working with the properties and changing the transformation and the anchor point, be sure to send me a line. I'm sure other people would really appreciate that tip. The reason why we've moved this anchor point is I want to be able to scale this title and have it move from the left side in my example. The main reason for publishing that X scale is to accommodate a longer name or a shorter name, and if I have that published, it's much easier to access inside Final Cut Pro. To demonstrate, I'm going to open up the completed composition that I already have, and you can see under my project my X scale, and I can just scrub that back and forth to best suit my needs. Jumping back into the lesson that we're currently working on, you're going to notice that my title card is the same color as my main bar. And so we're going to go in here and just change these colors a little bit to differentiate it, and we can see that a little bit more clearly. Just like previously, I'm going to choose to publish these colors. So I'm clicking on my swatch and then going to the color and hitting publish. I'm opening up my project settings just so I can review that I do have my name colors and my text body colors. To help better separate this title card from the background, I'm going to add a drop shadow on that title card layer. I'm going to add quite a bit of distance here and a bit of a blur, and I think I'm going to change my angle to about 370. As I'm working through this, I'm going to fine tune this just a little bit more, and I think I'm going to need to change that angle to about 400 instead. The next step for me is I'm going to create a new shape layer for a box for our person or logo. A lot of times I'm just going to create a shape, and the main reason for that is I may be just lining things up in my composition, but we're also going to end up using this as an image mask for our drop zone. I'm going to rename that to DZ mask. And I can see that in my timeline I'm a little further along. I'm just going to scrub to the beginning of my timeline, select my layer, and hit the I key just to shift everything to the beginning of my timeline. Next, we'll come to our add object and add a drop zone. And by default, it's going to fill the entire screen. And that's not necessarily what we're looking for. So using the property transport controls, we're going to scale it and place it roughly on our rectangle. Pressing Command left bracket, I can actually move its layer stack up and down so I can place this behind my rectangle to line things up. Because I want this drop zone to only exist inside this mask, I'm going to right-click my drop zone and add an image mask and then drop the DZ mask into my image mask layer. I can see that I'm just a little off center, so I'm just going to take that and just move it a little bit until I feel that that's correct. Since we already have this shape layer, I'm going to go ahead and duplicate it, effectively creating a second rectangle, and we're going to rename this rectangle to Outline. I'll activate my outline, and I'm going to go to the color and turn off fill and turn on outline. From here, we'll change the color of that outline to a bit of a blue, and what I'm going to do is work with a little bit of this width and scale it down just so it gives a nice frame for our image. I think we're going to change our width to about 15. Just like with our title card, I can take our drop zone and go to the drop zone layer and activate a bit of a drop shadow on there, again to separate it from the background a little bit. Now that I've laid this out, I can see I'm going to need a little bit more room in this title card, which isn't a bit of a problem because I can go to my title card, X scale, and adjust that to give myself that room for my name. Using the type tool, I'm just giving myself a little spot here to write out my subtitle. Once I'm happy with my subtitle, I'm going to click off of there and click my title tool again and create my title layer. To give a little bit of separation, I'm going to change the color of my main text here, and let's change this bottom to a thinner stroke. At this point, I'm pretty happy with this. Now I'm just finalizing my layout decisions. Using the type tool again, we're going to make our body text. With the light text on light background, it's a little hard to read, so we're going to change the appearance and make that a bit darker. A note when you're creating broadcast graphics for television, thin strokes may phase due to interlacing, so whenever possible, try to make your text as bold and as thick as you possibly can for maximum readability. In my case, I'm going to change this to a bold and make it about 72 points. To best fill up the space that I've set up here, I'm going to actually format the alignment to a justify all. We've completed the initial design of our title, so let's turn on our title background and review everything that we have completed. Collapsing all those items, we'll review. We have our main group, which we can put to the bottom right now. That's our demonstration group. We have our title background, which is the picture of the desert that I shot. And then we have our title bar group, which is what we just put together. The next step is going to be taking all of these different items and animating them across time to complete our title. I'm going to start with this title bar group, and the easiest way to animate this is just to animate this whole group. So I'm at about the 38, 39 frame, and I'm going to go to my inspector and turn on a keyframe and go to the beginning and make a second keyframe and move this one all the way down. I'm pretty happy with that for right now. However, I want to finesse the rest of this title a little bit more. In my example, I had each of these individual items all animating at the same time. If I'm animating that, I don't want to be distracted by this constantly popping up and down. So what I can do with that is I can actually go to my properties and disable the animation. What disabling the animation will do is it still keeps those keyframes there, it just turns them off. So as I'm scrubbing back and forth, it's not going to be popping on and off. Because I'm working in a 60 frames per second timeline, I know most of my animation needs to be done before this 3840 frame marker. To start animating these items, I'm going to work with this large block of text, and we're going to add a behavior to it. So I'm going to come down to my text sequence, text basic, and add a drift in behavior. Each time we use a behavior, it has its own default value set, so we're going to change those. For example, I can see under my format that it's actually moving negative 220 pixels on the x-axis. Let's change that to 0 and instead move it on the y-axis negative 240 pixels. On my format settings, I can see that it is starting at 0% opacity, fading in, and moving 240 pixels up. To further work with this, I'm going to change the value from all to a line. So if I play this back, I can see each line is animating up, and I want to change the speed to a decelerate, so it slows down as it animates on. Next, I'm just going to adjust the timing of this and change the spread to about 5. Now that we've set an animate in parameter, let's go ahead and set something for the animate out. Could create a new one, but my purposes, I'm going to hit Command D to duplicate this one and place at the end of my timeline. Something to note though, as I play this back, you'll notice that it's not behaving the way that we would want to, but it's behaving exactly like it's supposed to. Let's review the first one, and I can see in the first drift in example that it is animating from 0 opacity and negative 240, and our end item is doing the same thing, starting at 0 and moving to 100%. Compensate for this, we're going to need to reverse some of our items. In my case, I'm moving to negative 240 and 0%. However, it's still running a bit backwards, and that's because it's starting from the top down, and we want to change the direction backwards. In our first one, it's moving forward from 0% negative 240, and in the end, it's now moving backwards to negative 240 and 0% opacity. To ensure that my text doesn't pop up at the end, I'm just going to take my layer and trim it to the end of that drift and do the same at the beginning of my drift. Let's turn on that title bar group animation again and just review our animation as it comes on. I can see that my text is already built in, so I'm just going to adjust the timing of that so as it's coming on, it is also building in. Using those same principles, I invite you to animate the rest of those different items, so our name and our subtitle. The only difference that I have created in my end example is I've used a move behavior for the drop zone. In interest of time, I'm not going to recreate each one of those steps, but I invite you to check them out should you be so inclined. We've completed animating our title, and now what we want to do is animate our title background so it looks like our motion of our title is pushing our title background. There's just a couple notes that we want to be aware of. We want this to move fairly naturally in the background, and we don't want it to move too fast or too slow. You'll see what I'm talking about in a second. Using keyframes right around our build-in marker, we're going to set a keyframe for its position, and then go back towards the beginning of our timeline and set another keyframe. This will lock it in place. Let's go back to the first keyframe and just drag the Y all the way up so it looks like it's going to be pushed by that title. As I'm reviewing this, I can see I have a bit of an issue right here. You see this dark spot? Let me turn on this transparency. What this means is as this is going to animate on, we're going to see some black when our video is playing. So that's not really what we want. We want this to be completely covered so we're not losing any video as it animates on. To fine-tune your animation, you may want to use the graph editor and adjust the interpolation of those keyframes across time. In this example, if I drag this, it's going to start very quickly and then slow to a bit of a crawl. And if I go in the opposite direction, it's going to start very slowly and then speed up across time. So I'm just going to fine-tune this just to fit my needs and ensure that I have no transparency visible. Now that I have my animate in, I want this to be identical on the way out. So I'm going to select my keyframes, right-click, and copy them. We'll then move to the end of our timeline and hit paste. And right now we have an issue because it's going back to that very first initial keyframe value, and that's not what I want. To use these same values, but to flip them in a way, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select these last two keyframes, right-click them, and reverse them. It's a little hard to see, so I'm going to click this button right here, which will resize my keyframe in my graph editor. And here I can see it is animating in, and then it is animating out. Reviewing this, I can see that we haven't animated out our actual title bar group. So I'm going to use the same principles, select our title bar group, move to the beginning of our timeline, and select those two keyframes. I'm going to copy them, and we're going to move to the end of our timeline and paste them. And just like previously, we're going to right-click them and reverse those keyframes. I'm going to review my animation one more time just to make sure that everything is animating properly. If you recall at the very beginning, I had created a drop zone out of this background layer. The reason why we want this to be a drop zone is because I'm going to be converting this drop zone 1 into a title placeholder. To convert this composition to a title template, we're going to convert this project to a title. And it gives me a dialog asking me, do I want to convert any of my different layers into a title placeholder? This is why I've made note of the drop zone 1. So if I choose drop zone 1, that will make that into a title placeholder. Once I hit convert, I can review that in my inspector and see that it is no longer a drop zone, but it is a title background. By publishing this as a title with a title background, any video that appears in Final Cut, such I have in my example here, will actually be affected by that title background. So in this case, it's actually pushing up. If I had published this as a generator, any background image would need to be placed into its own drop zone. I have this drop zone right here, and that drop zone at the bottom, that's this guy. That's this guy right here. That's the end of this particular example. Let's take a look at one more example. In our example B, I have another title that pushes from the right to the left. And in here I have some title, some bullet points. And what's interesting about this one is I have these colors set up for this background, but I have one controller that will change the color of all the different bullet points. I have this text that I can update as I write it. So let's go ahead and get started with lesson 28B. Starting with reviewing lesson 28B end, let's take a look at our published parameters. I have a build-in, build-out, and those correspond with my build-in and build-out markers that I have set at about 50 frames and 5 seconds and 10 frames. I also have a third marker in the middle of my timeline, and this is a poster frame. If I double-click this and I edit this marker, you can see that it says poster frame. And what this will do is if I'm in Final Cut and I create it and publish it, it's actually going to use that frame as its preview in Final Cut Pro 10. If you don't have any item in your placeholder graphic and you're just using the plain placeholder graphic, it's going to look a little bit like this. So you'll notice they all have that same kind of background. By setting that poster graphic, you can set a specific frame to show the completed animation. Let's jump back in and continue reviewing this. I have my main color that I can specify, and I also have this bar and bullet color. And like I showcased before, if I change one, they're all going to change. Let's take a look at how the layers are built up. I have just a placeholder that has my drop zone, and I have my title. And my title consists of the bar, the title, and all the bullet points, along with a little website at the bottom there. Let's open 28B Start and get started. I'm going to go to the beginning of my timeline and create keyframe, and then we're going to go a little bit further and create a second keyframe. And then I always go back to the very first keyframe and I animate backwards because I like to see where things are coming and going. I'm happy with that animation. I just want to retime this a little bit. So I'm going to grab the keyframes in the layer stack and just retime them so it comes in a little bit sooner and it stays put so the rest of the items can animate. Because I've animated this in, I'm going to want to use these same keyframes to animate them out. So I'm just turning off the parameters I'm not using. One little tip I picked up from another user named Brett Williams is if you are working in motion and have all these different panels open, it'll actually slow motion down as you're working with it. So by closing some of these extra panels, you might get some performance boost. Pretty interesting. Thought I'd share that piece of information. Let's take those two first keyframes and we're going to copy them and paste them at the end of our timeline again. And from there, we're going to right-click and reverse keyframes. So that way they animate in, and that way they'll animate out. Since we want to animate these bullet points, I'm going to go back to this main group and just disable that animation again. Just that way I'm not distracted by it. If you look at my layer group in my bullet point, it is made up of a single rectangle and a bullet point piece of text. Be aware that in my rectangle group that is my bullet point, I have a link behavior on each one of these. What this link behavior does is it'll take one parameter and attach it to another parameter of a different layer. In my case, I have all of these different rectangles linked to the color of this particular line. So when I change the color of this line, they'll all change at the same time. This way, by publishing the color of just the line, I can effectively color all of them without having to have multiple different published parameters. Let's close all these bullet points and just focus on animating this bullet point 1. I have a few different ways I can animate this. I can use keyframes or behaviors. Let's talk about something interesting that happens if you use a behavior in a keyframed group. So I'm going to go to my behaviors and use a move behavior, and I'm just going to finesse this a little bit and move it down from about 3000 pixels. And we're just going to shift this so we can review how this is animating on. I'm going to re-enable the animation for my title layer so we can see how both of them are moving at the same time. I'm going to give that a little room, and you can see what's happening with this behavior. It's not linked inside of that group. Because the group has a keyframe, it doesn't necessarily care or follow that. It's following the absolute values of my canvas. To make sure that those bullet points stay inside that title group layer, we're going to use keyframes. So let's get rid of that move behavior in our bullet point 1, and instead, we're going to set keyframes in the Y position parameter. Using the same keyframe principles from before, we're going to be animating this on the Y-axis by setting a keyframe, and I'm also going to be animating the opacity, because we want this to start at 0% opacity, then go up to 100%, set a second keyframe for where our end position is, go back to the beginning, and set that first position. Check out this animation path that's happening now. It's taking into account its position within this group layer. And this looks like it's going to work out a little bit better for our situation. This is an example of when you would want to use keyframes instead of behaviors. To complete the rest of the animation with bullet points 2 through 5, I'll actually get rid of them, and I'm going to duplicate bullet point 1. I'll go ahead and rename this bullet point 2, and it follows the same animation curves, and instead, I'm going to move my anchor point 180 pixels down. By moving just the anchor point and not the position, I'm not going to be messing up those keyframes I've already set. I'm merely setting a new starting point. Let's go through that process one more time. I'm going to duplicate my bullet point again, and this time I'm going to name it bullet point 3. And what we're going to do is shimmy it over in our timeline a little bit, just so that way they're staggered as they come in. And I'm going to add another 180 to this to make a anchor point of 360. So now because I've offset them in time in my timeline, I want to make sure that they all take place before the build-in marker. If I have my animation taking place after my build-in marker, things are going to get really funky. So you really want to make sure that all your keyframes end before your build-in marker. Now that we have our main title animated, the last thing that we're going to want to do for this animation is animate this background. So let's close our title and work with this placeholder. I'm going to go to the top of my layer stack and just collapse everything. And let's move this keyframe again to the beginning of our build-in marker. And I'm just going to create a new keyframe right there and go back to the beginning and create another keyframe. Using these keyframes, I'm just going to animate this placeholder so that way it looks like it's being pushed over to the side as that title layer is coming in. Again, I want to be careful not to have any of that black space, so I'm just going to finesse the timing of this to make sure that everything has full coverage. Once I'm happy with that built-in animation, I'm going to go into my graph editor and select my X keyframes, go to the end, and copy and paste those keyframes while also reversing them. So I have a nice smooth in and out. You'll see that I'm fine-tuning my animation at the very end here because I want to make sure that I have that full coverage. So it looks like the title is actually pushing it without leaving any blank spots in my video. Because we want to convert this Dropzone into a title placeholder, I'll go to my image, but you'll notice if I choose my type, it won't let me select placeholder. So I have to go into my file, convert project to title. From there, we're going to choose our title source, and in my case, I have it as Dropzone. So I'm going to choose that Dropzone, and now it is a title background. To complete this project, what we'll do now is just publish it as a title template. So there you have two different ways that you can be creating these push titles based off of LenoFX's sidebar titles. Be sure to check out LenoFX's website, where there they've got lots of different titles and templates for you to purchase and download. Special thanks to Leno for letting me do this project. Again, my name is Stanislaw Robert Liberto with AV Ultra. Thanks a lot for watching, and stay Ultra.